Okay, so it's streaming now. Okay. All right, so we're good to go now.
Okay.
So thank you. Have a nice afternoon.
You're welcome. Have a nice one too.
All right, thank you.
Bye.
Bye. All right, thank you for tuning in. I think we're ready to begin. Thank you for tuning in today to yet another webinar by Scope Markets and Sylvia's Trading Lounge, also known as Forex STL. My name is Gilbert, and today I will be talking about central bank policy in trading. And it's part of a larger part of analysis called fundamental analysis. I've touched on fundamental analysis a little bit in the past, and today we're mostly going to be talking about the central banks. So let me share my screen as we start, just so that you can see the presentation points. Now, of late in Kenya, we've been having some challenges, of course, with regards to loans and all this, and we've also been referring to the IMF and trying to ensure that we don't take up any loans. So it's good for us to kind of have an understanding as to how we've come to this situation and what type of government policy basically results in this kind of a situation. And it's not unique to Kenya. A lot of countries are experiencing that. All right, so I'll try and reference a little bit about Kenya because most of the people tuning in today are from Kenya. But you can apply this kind of analysis in your own economy or in the currencies that you're trading or the economies that you have an interest in. All right, so the importance of central bank policy in trading. Now, before we begin, we have to know what a central bank is, right? So what is a central bank? Now, a central bank is, it's also actually a bank, as the name suggests, but it's an independent national authority, and it is tasked to control monetary policy in an economy. Now, government control in an economy is in two forms. There is fiscal policy and there is monetary policy. I'll be talking about fiscal policy, the differences between fiscal policy and monetary policy in the course of the presentation. But the central bank is the one that is in charge of monetary policy. Then fiscal policy, it's a country's Ministry of Finance, or the equivalent of the Ministry of Finance, that is tasked with fiscal policy. But there's a lot of that goes into fiscal policy because it's controlled by the executive in terms of the Ministry of Finance, but the legislative arm of government has also got to authorize what the Ministry of Finance wants to do. So central banks are to do with monetary policy, and they also regulate the banks, and they provide financial services, including economic research. So they're the ones who also advise on what the economy is going through and what measures the government needs to take in order to ensure that there is a healthy economy going forward. The goals of these central banks are to stabilize the nation's currency, to keep unemployment low, and to prevent high levels of inflation. And as we said, that this is an independent body, and it's governed by a board of we'd call them like a board of directors, but we just call them the board of the central bank. And it's made up of its member banks. So if it's a Federal Reserve has different banks that make up the Federal Reserve, and that is because it's a federation. So these states used to be independent. But when we come to Kenya, I'm not quite sure how the board members of our central bank are arrived at, but what happens is that they have to have the interests of the entire nation at hand. So it cannot be members who have personal interests in certain commercial banks. So it has got to be members who have the greater national interest at heart. All right, so the roles of these banks in the economy, as I've said, is to regulate the flow of money in their respective economies. We all know that the central bank is the one that regulates our currency. It may not be the one that's particularly printing. It may outsource that function for printing the actual coins to another company that is good at printing those coins and printing the money and creating the coins. I think here in Kenya we know who that is. I think I've forgotten their name, but we usually, it's a Dalio. Yes, Dalio. That is the one that is in charge of creating the currency and creating the paper currency that we have, and also the coins. But that is under the mandate of the central bank, and it's the one that acts as the authority for the country's monetary policy. And I'll be talking about monetary policy later on. There are two forms of monetary policy, but ideally the purpose is threefold. It's number one, to stimulate GDP growth, also to create more employment in the economy. So by stimulating the economy and making it easier for businesses to thrive, what happens is that the ripple effect is more people become employed, because businesses are doing well, they're expanding, and more people get employed. As more people get employed, what happens? They start to spend more. And as they spend more, businesses make more money and expand further. So what the bank is doing with monetary policies to stimulate that growth, to also increase the employment or reduce the unemployment. So what we usually look at is unemployment, the rate of people who are unemployed. So the mandate is to reduce that unemployment rate, and also to manage inflation, because by stimulating growth and also increasing employment, it tends to have another effect of inflation, and inflation means that the prices of goods and services in the economy go up. And if they go up too quickly, that can lead to stagnation later on. So what happens is that the bank looks at those three things: manage inflation, ensure that there's a steady balance of payments, that is imports and exports. At times, if a country is importing more than it's exporting, and it's just increasing in the imports, but it's not increasing in the exports, then what happens is that the nation starts to lose the foreign exchange. And that foreign exchange reserve is the one that kind of mandates the strength of the currency, because the one that has an effect. It's not the only one, but it's one of the things that have an effect on a currency's exchange rate. So the central bank has got to manage that, and of course, stimulate the economic growth and the rise in employment. So on a macro basis, the bank will be influencing interest rates as a way of being able to control inflation. So if they want to stimulate growth, then they'll reduce the interest rates so that they can make money easily accessible in the economy. So there's going to be free flow of money. But once it starts reflecting in the form of inflation, so once we start to see inflation rising up, then what they'll do is that they'll increase the interest rates as a way of taking that money or more money out of circulation so that they can be able to manage inflation. And on a micro scale, they will be setting the commercial bank's reserve ratios and acting as a lender of last resort when necessary. We had this kind of a situation in Kenya some few years back with Chase Bank. You remember this bank called Chase Bank? It's now known as SBM. But at that time, with Chase Bank, we were almost having a bank run on Chase Bank. People noticed that there's a problem with the bank. They wanted to go and withdraw their money in mass. And of course, a bank does not have everyone's money at the same time. Your deposits are being used to lend other people who want to borrow. So if these people have not paid back that debt and the depositors want their money back, of course, there's going to be a shortage, and that's called a bank run. And a bank run in one bank can have a spiral effect in bank runs in other banks, because people are going to start questioning if that's happening to Chase Bank, such a big bank, then what about these other banks? Could my bank also be in problems? So you'd also want to go and withdraw your money. So what happened is, the central bank had to step in and ensure that there's some form of control to cool down people's anxiety over what was going on, and allow the bank enough time, for the bank enough time to organize itself, and even the central bank to step in and assist it, and be able to get maybe other banks that would want to buy out or want to improve the liquidity of that bank or inject more liquidity into that bank so that it does not collapse. And eventually we did have a solution for it, with another bank coming in and buying it, a foreign bank coming in and buying it. Now it's SBM. So central banks act as lenders of last resort to banks that are in financial distress, and this is necessary. We also have insurance companies that we have the reinsurance companies, the ones that also act like a buffer for insurance companies that are having a bit of an issue. But of course, we can't compare that to a central bank. Central bank has a bigger authority than these reinsurance companies. So what are the major central banks in the world? So we know US is the largest economy. So by default, they have the largest bank, the largest central bank, and it's called the Federal Reserve. And the total assets that it has is 7.4 trillion US dollars. So that is the largest central bank in the world. That is followed by Bank of Japan with about 6.5 trillion dollars. Then we have the People's Bank of China with 5.1. Now note that the Chinese economy is greater than that of Japan, but that does not necessarily mean that their central bank should have more assets. So Bank of Japan still has more assets than the PBOC, or the People's Bank of China, then followed by the Bundesbank for Germany, 1.9 trillion, Bank of France 1.2, Bank of Italy 1.1, Bank of Spain 1.1, Swiss National Bank 1.1, 3. I think these three have something almost similar. Then we have the Bank of England at 1 trillion, and we have the Bank of Brazil at about 720 billion. Now, I just did the top 10 list, but after the Central Bank of Brazil, I think it's the one for Russia coming in just at number 11. So somewhere down that list, you'll find Kenya and the other developing nations, but these are the largest or the major central banks in the world. Now, if we are to look at the one for US, now this information is dated January 2021, so January of this year. And prior to coronavirus, the Federal Reserve total assets stood at about $5 trillion. So it increased, by an extra about 2.7 or 2.5. Yeah, so it increased by another about 2.5, almost $3 trillion. And that was part of its open market operations of ensuring stability in the economy because of the coronavirus. And most central banks did that. Most central banks assets have gone up. And these assets are in form of what would call debt, right? Them taking on, buying up debt in the economy. And this could be government debt. It could also be from corporates as well, who've issued corporate bonds, and they are in need of this financing to ensure that they remain afloat during that period. So those are part of what we call the open market operations, where the central bank goes on a buying spree to try and ensure that there is liquidity in the market. So they provide money, or they increase the money supply so that there's more money in circulation and people can relax a bit, and businesses can still be able to continue running. So this increased by almost 3 trillion within a span of about a year. And that tends to happen. Okay, this has been the largest increase in recent history. And of course, that is because of the kind of a situation we're in. Now, what constitutes these total assets? So a large part of it is, and in this case, I'm just giving the example of the Fed Reserve. That's because it's the largest central bank. And about 4.7 trillion out of that, almost 7 trillion, right? It's 7.5 trillion about. So about 4.7 of it is in the form of US Treasury notes and bonds. So what I was talking about, it goes into the debt market. So they go buying up debt in the market. So that could be mostly in the form of US Treasury bills and bonds. So that's government, in terms of government debt, but it also gets into corporate debt as well. Then the next largest is about 2 trillion, which is mortgages. And the mortgage industry in the US is very big. We can't compare that to a country like Kenya, where our mortgage industry has not been that big, but within the last 10 years, it has really grown. And that is because most Kenyans never really used to buy houses based off of a mortgage, like a fully made out house. And it's only within the recent 10 years, we've started seeing people going and buying ready-made houses and taking up mortgages. So we can say that, now our mortgage industry is growing, but it still needs a lot of work because those interest rates are still quite high for most people to afford to be able to buy a house and pay for it over, let's say like a 30-year period. So we don't have that in the country, where you can have a mortgage for 30 years, 30, 40 years, whereby the monthly repayment is even less than what you'd be spending in terms of rent. And that's what they've done in the developed world. And that's a level that we need to get to in order for us to say that if we're going to provide affordable housing, and we're going to have a goal for everyone to be able to own a home, so long as you have an income, a dependable income, that you can be able to own a home, then we'll need to space out those mortgages to take more years, like 30-year, 40-year mortgages, such that it would make sense for you to actually take a mortgage instead of renting, because what you'll be paying back every month is even cheaper than what you'll be paying if you are renting. But anyway, so this is what constitutes a major part of those Federal Reserve assets. All right, so let's talk about this fiscal policy and monetary policy. And I said that fiscal policy is controlled by the executive and the legislative arm of government, and that is the Ministry of Finance. Like in Kenya, we have the Ministry of Finance with the backing of the Parliament, because some of this like the budget requirements have got to be passed. We usually know the CS for finance usually goes to Parliament, presents the budget, and then they're able to vote on it. They're able to vote on what they'll accept and what they'll reject. So that's fiscal policy. It's more to do with tax collection and spending. It's more to do with tax collection and spending. Then we have monetary policy, which is under the central bank. And it's more to do with stimulating the economy and just being able to manage the economy using interest rates. So when they lower the interest rates, more money supply, there's more supply of money in the economy. If inflation levels get to an alarming rate, then they start adding the interest rates so as to take that money out of circulation. And this is done in a steady way to ensure that we do not have aggressive what we call aggressive boom and bust cycles. That is when there's a period of prosperity when asset prices increase in value so much, and then there has to be a correction after that. And then it gets to a very sharp correction, which leads to a recession and even at times a depression. So to avoid those very aggressive boom and bust cycles, what happens is that the central bank has got to be able to regulate the flow of money in such a way that, of course, there'll always be those cycles and there'll be periods of correction and periods of expansion. But the mandate of the central bank is to ensure that it's not that aggressive. All right, both policies together have great influence over our nation's economy, its businesses and its consumers. So fiscal policy is more political. There are times it may not be economic. I think we're going through such a situation here in Kenya where we're feeling as though the fiscal policy that the government is taking up is not in line with economic progress compared to the previous regime, the NAG government of 2002 to around 2007, whose policy I think really improved the economy. So right now we are kind of in that situation where we're feeling that the fiscal policy is not in line with the aspirations of people. And that is because it's quite political. However, monetary policy does not involve any politics. If we look at how our central bank is managing things, if you look at how it's managing our currency exchange rate, even when the World Bank is really on its neck about the strength of the Kenya shilling, our central bank has maintained its own monetary policy and it sticks to it regardless of what everyone else says. So you have those two, and a government, in order for you to have a healthy economy, you have to have a good balance of the two, because this is to do with money supply and this is to do with government spending and taxes. So if the fiscal policy is not in line, it's not progressive as the monetary policy, then it's still a challenge. If the monetary policy is not as progressive as the fiscal policy, then there lies a challenge. So there has to be some kind of harmonization between the two policies. All right, so let's look at fiscal policy. So fiscal policy is, as we said, is determined by the country's Ministry of Finance or the equivalent. And in this diagram, you can see the fiscal policy types. So we have two types of fiscal policy. There's expansionary fiscal policy and contractionary fiscal policy. So expansionary fiscal policy is to do with stimulating economic growth. So this is when the government wants the economy to grow. So they want to expand the economy. And in expanding the economy, it means that the government is going to spend more. So what it will do, it will try to reduce taxes on companies, either reducing the actual tax rate be it the corporate tax rate, or be it capital gains, whatever types of taxes that it determines, or even giving tax, they're called tax credits, whereby if you're in a certain industry that the government favors for economic growth, what they do is that if you're investing in that particular sector, you get some tax breaks. So you could, let's say, be due to pay taxes of, let's say, for example, 5 million shillings. But if you do have a tax credit, and the tax credit is, let's say, 3 million shillings, then it means instead of paying that 5 million, you're actually going to end up paying 2 million, because the government has given you a tax credit of 3 million. So you actually just end up paying the balance, which is 2 million. And that is just to spark economic activity. So you tend to see the tax regime goes down, or they try and reduce taxes, and they increase government spending. Now, this government spending can be financed through the budget, can be financed through government revenues. So that means the government, based off of its raising of taxes and other revenue streams, it's able to finance the entire budget and be able to cater for this expansionary policy that it's having. However, if it does not have that money, then that's when it needs to go and borrow. So it can borrow from the public, as we've been seeing in Kenya with the Euro bonds that we've been having. And it may also go to some of these other lenders like the IMF and World Bank for specific projects. It may also choose to engage in private, they call public-private partnership, triple Ps or PPPs, whereby the government, instead of taking up the entire task of financing that project, it can engage the private sector to, co-share the expenses, or to co-share the cost of financing that government project. And this government spending, what it does is that it, as it creates more and more of this public, we call it public works, mostly in the form of projects, infrastructure projects, things that fall under public works. And what that happens is that all the businesses are able to profit from that, the ones that are in that business, and they can be able to create more employment. Kind of like what you've been seeing here with what was happening with the SGR, what's happening with all these highways that we're constructing, dams that we're constructing, ports that we're constructing. It's creating employment, right? And of course, this employment means more and more people will have purchasing power. They'll be able to earn enough income for them to purchase goods and services in the country. And of course, these other companies that are supplying different goods and services that are needed by people on a day-to-day basis, of course, they will also prosper. So it has that trickle-down effect. So it comes from the government in form of government spending on public works or infrastructure projects or other types of government projects. It even could be things even to do like with building schools. It can be just anything that falls under government projects where it needs companies, private companies, to come in and do the job, bid for those jobs, bid for those tenders. So that's the expansionary fiscal policy, and that usually creates more employment. If done right, it's going to create more employment, and the goal is for it to be, a steady and long-lasting employment, not for it to just be employment right now and then after that, it's over and done with. So that's the expansionary. Contractionary fiscal policy is when, because this expansionary fiscal policy will eventually lead to inflation. A good example of this is, of course, here in Kenya, we've been having our inflation rate at about 5-point-something%. I think this time around it's about 5-point-something. If you look at historically, it was before Corona, it was about 4.8 or so. And inflation is the rate at which, number one, your purchasing power is going down. And that is because your currency is losing value. And on the opposite side, it means the prices of goods and services are going up. So most people, when they're describing inflation, they usually talk about, it's the rate at which consumer goods prices are going up. But what that also means is that your currency is losing value. And when you understand that your currency is losing value, it means that during an expansionary, when you're having this expansionary fiscal policy, which the after effect is going to be inflation, it means, if you're just saving, you're just holding on to cash, you'll eventually end up losing, because if that money is not working for you, if it's not increasing its value in form of interest at a rate higher than the inflation rate, then it means you're actually losing purchasing power. All right, so when inflation levels go up, maybe the government decides, it wants to ease up on economic growth just to prevent, those aggressive cycles. So what it does is that it takes on a contractionary fiscal policy where government spending starts to go down. They start cutting down, government projects. These projects that they were engaging in, they start reducing. They start prioritizing, the ones that are the most necessary. And as a way of also taking money out of circulation, they also increase the taxes, right? So they may choose to also increase the taxes. If they had borrowed this money during the expansionary period and it's getting to a point where they're not being able to service the debt, then what will happen is, in order for them to start servicing that debt, they'll have to increase the taxes. And I think you've noticed, especially this year, we started to see, a new tax regime coming in, in the form of digital tax. That was starting to be introduced even before COVID, because we were already in somewhat of a recession. We had seen government spending going down. We did have, yes, the major infrastructure projects, but when we talk about county level projects, they had stalled. A lot of county level projects had stalled already. So the government had already started taking a bit more of a contractionary fiscal policy. And it had to change that during COVID because, COVID meant that we were going to go back deeper into a recession. So they had to increase a bit of government spending, try to manage the situation. But at some point, if the inflation levels get too high, we're likely to see them take a contractionary fiscal policy where government spending goes down and they start increasing taxes. And I think we're going to be kind of ushered into a contractionary fiscal policy, especially with this IMF loan that's coming in, where there are some strings attached. Government will need to raise money to finance this, the payment of these loans and other loans that we have, and that results in taxes going up. All right, so in a nutshell, expansionary fiscal policy seeks to increase overall demands of goods and services. That is called aggregate demand through a combination of increased government spending and tax cuts. So that's during the expansionary phase. The idea is that by putting more money into the hands of consumers, the government can stimulate economic activity during times of economic contraction. Using tax cuts, whether in the form of rate reductions or refundable credits, what I was talking about, the refundable credits, that will put more money directly into the pockets of consumers. And you tend to have two groups. There are those groups who believe that cutting taxes is the way to go. That's how you're going to leave people with more money for them to spend. Others are not really so much into cutting taxes. They're more of, the government should just, spend more, right? So we should be looking at, coming up with infrastructure projects or other projects to spark economic activity. So not necessarily reducing taxes, because if you reduce tax, maybe the wealthy, as we've seen, if they're paying less taxes, where does this money usually go to? It goes into buying private jets and, private yachts and other things. It may not necessarily trickle down. It does not mean that, oh, now that you're paying less corporate tax, what we're going to do is we're going to expand our operations and we're going to do this. You may find that people are going to be like, okay, now we have more money, so we can pay ourselves even more as the top part of, the senior level, senior managers or senior level of the people who run the company. They may decide to pay themselves more. So it doesn't usually have, it's not always that it's going to have the desired effect by just cutting taxes, but it does help. especially if it's very structured, such that it is companies that are in a certain field or a certain sector that the government really needs to stimulate growth in that sector. And there should also be, measures to ensure that this money, again, does not end up in the hands of, the upper level management in the form of, what do they call it? There's this thing that they call when they're giving themselves benefits. And now you're seeing government starting to tax benefits, things like house allowance, all these things. So they try and push it there so that they're not taxed. So anyway, there are those two groups. There are those ones who are pro lowering taxes as a way of expanding the economy. There are those ones who are more, more government spending. You can still have the taxes, reduce them a little bit in key sectors, but ideally it's the government spending that's going to increase economic activity. So increased government spending, especially in public works, is done to increase the overall level of employment. So this is just to do with employment growth, because employment growth means more purchasing power, people are able to spend more, and businesses end up thriving. So it's somewhat of a link, right? So if more people are employed, it means more people have access to credit, more people can spend. If more people are able to spend, then there'll be demand for goods and services, more demand for goods and services. Companies supplying that or catering to that demand and to that demand that's coming in for goods and services, the ones supplying it, their businesses will hire more. They'll expand, they'll hire more, they'll also spend more in the form of how they're going to expand. Like if it's expanding in the form of building more manufacturing plants, then that's more business for the people who are going to be in that construction. And they'll also have to employ more people to do that. So it has a ripple effect. Then the contractionary one that we're talking about, this is where the government collects more money in tax revenue than it spends. And it's used during times of economic prosperity. So when things have been too good, they've been really, really good, and inflation levels are starting now to rise, that's the time the government takes on a contractionary fiscal policy. So in this case, the purpose is to slow down inflation and reduce prices, to slow down the pace of economic growth, to prevent aggressive boom-bust cycles, keep unemployment at manageable levels, to slow down wage level growth that can influence inflation. Also, something that I didn't mention, we tend to think that when unemployment rate, the number of people who are unemployed, if we reduce that to zero, then that means that's going to be very good for the economy. But case in point, like Australia, sometime around between 2010 to 2013, what had happened is that unemployment levels had gone really, really low, such that there was, instead of there being more demand for jobs, it's actually the companies that were trying to look for people, and they didn't have people. So there was a shortage of employees or people who can get to the work. I mean, there's a shortage of employees. Yes, I think that's the best way. So there's a shortage in the workforce. And what happens is when there's a shortage like that, the wage levels rise. And if the wage levels rise, it means that the businesses or the companies have got to factor in that cost in the overall price of the goods and services that they're supplying. So what happens? Inflation comes in. So in Australia, there's a time they were having the highest wage levels. People who are working in the iron mines, they're working in the mines, therefore digging out iron ore. Those guys, as you know, that is what we call in Kenya, KYM, kazi ya mkono, and it tends to be, blue collar jobs. People were earning, I think, about 200 to 300,000 Australian dollars per annum. That's the amount of money that maybe senior level managers earn in the US, but that's a KYM who was earning that in Australia. And at that time, the Australian dollar had reached parity with the US dollar. It was even becoming now stronger than the US dollar. So that didn't last for long. At some point, there was an economic the economy started going down. Of course, it was influenced a lot by China. China's economic pace was slowing down, and that had an effect on Australia. And we also started to see the economy going down. And also those wage levels had to eventually go down. So it's important to also manage that unemployment, to be at, you can't have everyone employed, right? To the point whereby, there are businesses that are looking for workers and everyone is employed, there's no one else. It's a dangerous situation as well. And it's just, similar, well, not similar, but it has its own danger level compared to when there's so much unemployment. So many people are unemployed. Because that one even has far-reaching consequences, because it can lead to civil unrest when there are so many people who are unemployed. But when everyone is employed, there's no one to employ, that also has its own issues. It means that prices, it's likely to take the inflationary route. We're likely to start to see inflation. And reduce government debt. So the other purpose is to reduce government debt, to build up reserves for the future. Because during the expansionary phase, you take on a lot of debt. So during the contractionary period, the government is trying to reduce that debt to ensure that it still has some stockpiles for the future. Because remember, you have to pass down, a better economy to the next generation. You don't want to take up so much debt such that the next generation, they're taking on, a burden, a bigger burden. You haven't made their lives easier, you've actually made their lives worse. So governments have to think about that succession in terms of population. What is the next generation going to do, or what are we leaving for the next generation? All right, so that is to do with fiscal policy. Now, what about monetary policy? So how do central banks enforce monetary policy? So the main objectives of monetary policy there are three of them. That is managing inflation levels, reducing unemployment, and maintaining suitable long-term interest rates. So that's what the central bank is looking at. It's looking at managing inflation. It's looking at reducing unemployment. It's trying to make sure that there are more and more people who are employed, or at least control that level of unemployment such that it's at a suitable level. Of course, not everyone has a job, but most people have the jobs. So by trying to maintain something that is good for both businesses and also for the people who are coming into the workforce, and then also maintaining stable long-term interest rates. We don't want to be in an economy whereby the interest rates keep on changing every other season, because that affects our loans a lot, especially for people who are borrowing. So you'd want something a bit more steady, so that even the banks themselves, they can be able to give us good rates, because they're not feeling as though they have to overcompensate for maybe interest rate changes, which could happen anytime. So you'd want a situation whereby the interest rates are predictable and they're stable for a period of time, so that people learn how to deal with that kind of an environment. So you can imagine if our interest rates remain steady, like the central bank rate remains steady at about 6%, and our banks feel that that rate is quite steady and people are being able to pay off their debts, then they decide, what, they're also going to maintain their interest rates to us, the lending rate to the rest of the public, at about 11%, 10%, 11%. It means that businesses can be able to thrive. But if it reaches a point where the banks, because of the instability of the interest rates, they decide, what, we have to cater for a lot of defaults because of these weird interest rates keep on changing. So they end up giving us rates of about 18%, 20%, which of course in the long run are not sustainable by most businesses. Clearly, that has been the main issue in Kenya, and why we're seeing a lot of businesses going down is because the access to credit is such a challenge, and that credit is so expensive that most businesses are not able to maintain those interest rates, paying loans with those interest rates. And that has been one of the major things that was cited by these major retailers, the supermarkets, the supermarket chains, which have been going down. That is because, and other businesses that have been there, that other large companies that have gone down, and the one thing that they were citing that seems to be common across the board, may not be that that is the reason, but it's one of the reasons, is the kind of interest rate that we have here in Kenya is not, it's not manageable for some of these businesses. All right, so those are the main objectives: managing inflation, lowering unemployment, and maintaining good long-term interest rates. So monetary policy, just like fiscal policy, has two phases. We have the expansionary and contractionary policies. So during the expansionary policies, that's what we call the loose money policy. This is where interest rates are lowered. So the tools of the central bank in regulating this monetary policy is mostly interest rates. So they use interest rates as a way of managing inflation and also sparking growth, depending on what they want to do to spark growth so that they can reduce unemployment. So during this expansionary phase, interest rates are lowered. That means more access to credit. More and more people can be able to access credit. Businesses can be able to be started, and existing businesses can be able to expand. That means more employment. That means consumers are able to buy more, they're able to spend more, and that spending more, of course, continues to expand business within the economy. But then the effect of that is inflation. So prices of goods and services go up because there's more demand, right? If all of us now can afford, let's say, one of the things that people look at, especially here in Kenya, as a good gauge of purchasing power is luxury items such as meat. Meat is not, it's not like one of our staple foods. That is maize flour in the form of ugali, and maybe wheat flour in the form of uji. Or what is uji made of? Is it wheat or what is it? So we have those ones as the staple foods. So when people are buying more meat, when we start to see more demand for meat, it means that people's purchasing power has increased such that someone can decide, you know what, I'm now going to incorporate meat into my day-to-day food. In most cases, you're going to have meat maybe once in a while, in your 7-week meal. Maybe you're going to have it maybe once. The rest of the time, it's mostly going to be vegetables, which are easier to purchase, which are lower cost. But when you have more money, you're willing to do that, to incorporate meat. So they're able to tell that, oh, you see, the purchasing power has increased. So you can imagine a situation whereby, those meat prices go up because everyone is able to demand for them, to the point that now it becomes even unreachable. You start to see this is too expensive, and it's not just meat that is going up, everything is going up. Rent is going up, transport costs are going up, electricity going up. So things are just going up. So it reaches a point where you're not able to manage with all those expenses. So you start to cut spending. You take a back seat and you decide, you know what, let me cut all these things. If I was using an Uber most of the time, I'm not going to start taking the bus. If I was taking 2 hot showers a day, I'll have to be taking 1 hot shower and 1 cold shower, just so that I reduce the electricity bill. If I was taking meat, I'm going to have to incorporate more vegetables. If I was taking milk, I'll have to live with milkless tea, or I'll try to incorporate something else that's a bit cheaper, like porridge. So it has an undesired effect, which is inflation. This loose money policy, it's good for economic growth, but then it reaches a point where inflation levels go up. And of course, when inflation levels go up, the central bank has got to react by increasing the interest rates. So they increase interest rates, they make credit less accessible, and also those people who are paying back loans, they end up having to pay more in terms of interest. So what happens? The money is taken, more and more money is taken out of the economy, or out of the supply, so it goes back to the banking system. And of course, businesses then postpone the expansion. You may even find other businesses starting to streamline, so they are likely to even fire people. So you'll start to see people being laid off. So you see unemployment increasing, and of course production is reduced because more people who are unemployed means purchasing power in the economy goes down, less and less demand for goods and services. So again, businesses have to downsize or scale down on production. And if this continues, then we continue to be in a recession where you're starting to see the rate of growth is actually slowing down. And when you get to a depression is when it's negative. So the economy is actually losing value. Instead of at least trying to generate a little bit of value, it's now starting to lose. So that's the time when you hear, oh, we were growing at 5%, then at 4, 3, 2, that's now a recession, 2, 1, 0, now it's negative. And we had that during the Moi era, where there's a time where though I'd have to confirm that, but I remember stories of being told that the economy was actually at negative GDP at some point. So that just means that you're in somewhat of a depression because the economy is losing value now. It's not that it's growing at a slower rate, it's growing smaller and smaller, but now it's actually even losing value. It's not growing anymore. So those are the two monetary policies. So again, just going through them quickly. Expansionary monetary policy to increase money supply, stimulate the economy for growth. And this is done by reducing interest rates, lowering reserve limits, that is the amount of money that commercial banks have got to keep as a reserve with the central bank. So during this period, the central bank requires a smaller reserve limit. So they reduce that reserve limit, so the banks are able to take more of that money and lend it out to the public. And of course, the government, the central bank increases its open market operations. Earlier on, when I was talking about the open market operations in fiscal policy, in fact, I was actually, I had kind of merged monetary policy and fiscal. These open market operations are done by the central bank. But what happens in fiscal policy is that the treasury needs more and more money. So it's going to offer, these bonds out into the market as a way of raising money. And in this case, the central bank is the one that's going to be buying up most of those bonds so that it releases money to the government, and then the government is able to use that money for public works and other expansionary projects that it has. And the result is lower unemployment, increased growth. It also has another effect on the currency. It's a weaker currency and increased inflation. So during an expansionary phase, you end up having a weaker currency. Case in point, Turkey. If you look at Turkey, Turkey has been, in an expansionary phase for quite some time, about 2 decades now. And during that period, the kind of fiscal and monetary policies which are expansionary in nature have resulted in a weaker currency because the inflation levels went up. There was even a time where the inflation levels were at 30%. You can imagine, 30% back to back, for a year, the next year 30%. So it was quite high. The currency has devalued a lot, it still continues to devalue. In your Scope Markets platform, the Turkish lira is there. So the currency for Turkey is called Turkish lira. The currency code is TRY. So if you go to your Scope Markets platform and you look for currency code TRY, that's going to be the Turkish lira. And then you can maybe launch a chart for USD versus TRY or Euro versus TRY, and you'll be able to see how the Turkish lira has been devaluing over a period of about 20 years. And that's because of the expansionary policies that they've been having. So it does weaken the currency. And that is because inflation levels rise. And inflation it affects the currency strength. When you have lower inflation, then your currency is a bit stronger. But when you have, these inflation levels increase, or when you just actually have inflation, then your currency becomes weaker. So during the contractionary phase, these policies, the contractionary policies, are to control inflation levels. So and that's the reason why we have those cycles, the up and down cycles, the boom and bust cycles. And that is because as we expand, inflation comes in. So we have to contain that inflation. So again, we contract, the economy starts slowing down, and that is to deal with inflation. So once inflation levels go down, if they go down too much, then that could also lead to a recession. So what happens again? The government expands, the economy starts going back to the expansionary. So I want you to read up on those economic cycles. And there's a YouTube video done by one of the great hedge fund traders of our time, Dalio. He's a US hedge fund trader. He's also a multi-billionaire. I think he's worth close to $20 billion. He runs a hedge fund called Bridgewater Associates. It's one of the largest, if not the largest hedge fund in the world in terms of assets under management, over $100 billion. And he did a YouTube video. He's been quite vocal over the past 4 or so years. And he did a video called How the Economic Machine Works. It's an animated video, and you can find it on YouTube. I would urge you to go, if you want to understand these economic cycles, I would urge you to go watch that video. So the main purpose of contractionary monetary policy is to control inflation levels. And this is done by increasing interest rates and increasing the reserve limits to reduce the money supply. So inflation and asset bubbles. So we've said that inflation is the rate at which consumer goods prices are going up, or actually just the rate at which the prices for goods and services are going up. And in turn, it also means it's the rate at which your currency is devaluing. Most commonly used inflation indices are the CPI, Consumer Price Index, and the Wholesale Price Index, but also we can use the Producer Price Index. So in currency, in Forex, we tend to look at the CPI and the PPI, or Producer Price Index. But this can also be the Wholesale Price Index. So those with tangible assets during a period of inflation, those guys who have assets in terms of property, maybe shares, or even some of these stocked commodities, that may be prosperous for them. So inflation is good for people who have assets. And that's the reason why we are told that the rich keep getting richer, is because these currencies have been on a trajectory for devaluing. All currencies have been devaluing ever since we left the gold standard. Back in the day, currencies have been devaluing. We left the gold standard, and we stopped even pegging. We stopped that peg of $35 to an ounce of gold. That was around 71. Since then, currencies became fiat currencies. You know, they're backed by the state. Before, currencies used to be backed by gold reserves. Now they're backed by the state. So they're backed by the authenticity of the state. So confidence in your government, or confidence in your state, you know, such that you can trust that this money is actually worth what the government says it's worth. So since then, we've been, you know, seeing inflation, you know, increase more, and we've been seeing our currencies devalue even more. And that has been very good for people who own assets, because assets are in the opposite side of currency. The currencies are going down in value, and it means asset prices are going up in value. So if you own assets, and that's the reason why they say in order for you to be wealthy, you need to use that money that you have to buy assets, things that are going to go up in value. And assets are not cars, you know, fancy cars, which are, you know, they could be depreciating. Those could be termed as a depreciating asset if it's actually earning you money by maybe increasing your productivity, or maybe you put it out as an Uber. But if it's an expensive car, you know, and all it's costing you is, you know, in managing the expenses, and it's still depreciating, then it's not really an asset. But something like property, something that you can even lease out, and it earns you money as the value of the property even goes up over the years, and you end up being millionaire many times over without even working, just because the value of that property is going up, because currency level is going down, and there's still more and more demand for housing. So people holding cash are the ones who lose during an inflationary period. And that is because the value of your money is going down. So that means it costs you more to buy the same thing. But someone who has that asset For them, it's good because it means they earn more for their asset. So you've got to, as a trader, and even just as any human being in this planet, because these policies are there in every country, you need to understand the role of inflation, and you need to work towards acquiring assets, whatever they may be. They may be real estate, it may be in the form of paper assets like stocks and the like, but try as much as possible to acquire assets, because assets are going to go up in value, and your purchasing power in terms of cash is going to be on the opposite trajectory. It's going to be going down. So the value of your money is always going down. So ideally, an optimum level of inflation is required to promote spending to a certain extent, instead of saving, thereby nurturing economic growth. That's what we're seeing in Japan right now. Actually, for the last almost more than 1.5 decades, what they've been doing is that they've been having very low interest rates, and that is because they're in a deflation, right? They're having deflation in the economy. The prices of goods and services has been going down over a long period of time. In fact, this started in the 1990s. It has been going down, and they've been trying to kickstart, that economic growth, but it's not really been working. I would want you to go look at something called Abenomics, and that is based off of Shinzo Abe, the finance minister of Japan, and how he has been trying, to kickstart economic growth, but it's not been working according to plan, because those interest rates are really low. It means that ideally there should be inflation, but it's still not being able. They're not being able to get out of their deflationary cycle, or even if they get out of it, it doesn't, last for long. In Japan, of course, you don't get anything for your savings right now around the world because of reduced interest rates in US and the major economies. Savers are the ones who are suffering because you don't get anything for your savings. In some countries, it's actually negative interest. You get charged for your deposits. For saving with the bank, you get charged. Right. Inflation levels, of course, are low, and interest rates are low. And that favors people who are willing to take risks to borrow money and engage in economic activity or engage in business. All right. So right now we have been seeing, okay, I haven't addressed this issue for asset bubbles. And when there's a lot of this money in circulation, and of course inflation goes up, what happens is that this inflation can lead to asset bubbles. We saw those particular asset bubble getting towards 2007 there, 2006, 2007, in form of the housing market in US. And that, did not end up so well. It didn't end up well for US and also the global economy, because a lot of people buy US mortgages, or people participate in the US housing market, and of course that did not go so well. It was called, the Great Recession. And right now we are seeing asset bubbles in the form of the stock market, been going up crazily. We've also seen cryptocurrency. There seems to be a lot of money moving into certain asset classes like cryptocurrency, with Bitcoin and Ethereum prices and other cryptocurrencies. Dogecoin has been, the talk of, I think the talk of the week, because Elon Musk of SpaceX has said that I think people can buy tickets for space tourism with his company SpaceX using one of these cryptocurrencies called Dogecoin. So, we are seeing, increased demand for certain assets out there like cryptocurrency, and also US stocks that have surged to ridiculous levels. And at some point, when the central bank decides to control inflation by increasing interest rates, those asset classes, we're going to start to see, crashes, or they're going to start to contract. We're going to start to see the demand, go down, and of course, they're going to take a downward trajectory in terms of price. So in inflation, the losers are the savers, the people, the retirees who are living on a fixed income. So you can imagine if you've retired and the government, your retirement, maybe if you had a retirement scheme and it's paying you like 30K or 50K a month, and inflation levels have gone up by, let's say, 100% over a period of time. It means whatever it is that you now need to survive on, 100,000, not the 50,000, just to maintain the same quality of standard, the same quality of life. So high inflation does not go well for people who are living on, retirees who are living on a fixed income. Also people who, workers who have a fixed income. In terms of your salary you don't get inflation adjusted salaries. Very few businesses even here in Kenya, organizations in Kenya will adjust a salary according to inflation. Also, the other losers are borrowers on variable rates, because as inflation goes up, what happens is that at some point, if you are borrowing on variable rates, then that's not going to work so well for you. And the whole economy in general, from general economic uncertainty. And that is because we don't know what the price of goods will be the next day or the next month, like what was happening in Zimbabwe some years back, where the price of bread would change in the 6 times within the day. In the morning at 7 when you bought it, it's a certain price. Someone who's coming in at around 11 a.m., it's a different price. Someone who's coming in at 2 p.m., different price. Someone who's coming in at 6 p.m., different price. Someone who's getting to the supermarket just before it closes at 9 p.m., it's a different price. So, of course, high inflation does not do well for economic certainty. And exporters are also less competitive. But the winners of inflation are debtors on fixed repayment plans, governments with high public sector debt, because they can just print their way, they can just print that money to pay off that debt. Owners of land and other assets, so people who own assets, they're also going to benefit from that because the value of their assets is going to go up. And also farms who cut real wages. So farms who do not give inflation adjusted wages. So those ones who just, or even those ones who decide to lower the wages, those are the ones who profit from that, from high inflation. All right, so just to finish, I know we've gone a little bit out of time, but maybe this is just the last point I wanted to mention: money supply and stock market prices. Now, there are different types of money supply, and I want you to go read up on these 3 categories. There's M1 money supply, M2 money supply, and M3 money supply. Now, we're going to concentrate on M1. M1 is the most liquid, and it's the one that is in the form of transactions, cash transactions. So you're seeing currency in circulation and travelers' checks, but mostly this one for currency in circulation. So when we're looking at inflation and all these things in terms of money supply, at times you can look at M1, or M1 money supply is the best to look at because it's the one that is most liquid. So most people have access. And this is a chart just showing the NASDAQ index in US. It's for tech companies. So we have the NASDAQ. The NASDAQ is the one in orange. So it's a stock index that measures 100 technology companies, largest or most major technology companies listed in the NASDAQ exchange in the US. And the blue line is the M1 money supply. And this is supply, the M1 supply in billions of dollars. And on this other side, we are seeing the NASDAQ index in form of points. So this is M1 money supply increasing. So as you can see, in 2007, it was just at about 1.something trillion dollars. That has increased now to almost that $7 trillion that we were looking at. Right, it's increased to about 7 trillion, and you can see that spike that occurred in 2020. So it was a major spike up in 2020 because of coronavirus. That almost $3 trillion increase in money supply, of $3 trillion dollars worth of increase in money supply that we saw in the earlier chart. And we can also see the prices of the NASDAQ. So you can see at some point it was just not really going so the pace at which it was going up wasn't that much. But then we can see during this period it was accelerated. So the stock market eventually, because most of this money will find its way into the stock market. This was that period of quantitative easing to get us out of the Great Recession, where the central bank, the Federal Reserve, increased its open market operations by buying up a lot of debt in the market and increasing the supply, the money supply. Most of this money, or a sizable amount of it, found its way into the stock market. So we may see that even much better in the S&P 500 or the Dow Jones. But yes, it did also result in this stock index going up, because eventually that money went into the stock market, and we saw the value of shares go up. So we saw stock market prices go up. And it's talking about that as of July of 2020, there was $5.3 billion in M1 supply, which is 4 times the amount in January to, I think this is supposed to be trillion, but anyway, 4 times that amount in January 2007, where it was only 1.4. So this is trillion, sorry, because this is in billions. Sorry, so this figure here is in trillions. So meanwhile, in the NASDAQ, it increased from 2,400. If you look at where the NASDAQ was, to somewhere here, if you look at it there, 2,400 points, and it increased to 10,000 points, roughly showing the same 4 times increase. So we are seeing some kind of a correlation between M1 supply and the stock market rise in form of the NASDAQ index. So it shows like about a 95% correlation between M1 supply and the NASDAQ. So if you're interested in predicting the movement of stock markets over a period of time, then predicting the M1 money supply is one way of doing it. And who's in charge? What is the body that is in charge of money supply? That's a central bank. And that's the reason why central bank policy, this monetary policy, is important, not just for forex traders, but also for stocks. In fact, it's easier for us in stocks because the trajectory tends to be steadier in stocks than it is in forex, because currencies, if the US is doing this, increasing money supply, UK is also increasing money supply, the Eurozone is also increasing money supply. So currencies are just going to be fluctuating. But in terms of the stock market, it's going to be one trajectory. In that case, it's just an upward trajectory. So once the Federal Reserve reduces M1 money supply by cutting down on the current quantitative easing that they've engaged in because of COVID-19. So when they cut down on it, when COVID-19 effects have been stabilized, then the stock market prices are likely to cool down. And that's the talk in the market. When is the Fed likely to raise interest rates? When is the Fed likely to start scaling down on this current quantitative easing program that we're in? Because that will then tell us what the overall effect will be, because they will do that when they start to see inflationary pressure starting to rise. And they will now start doing that. They'll start increasing interest rates. They'll start reducing the amount of money in circulation. And of course, that will take a hit in the stock market. We'll start to see less and less demand for stocks, and that in turn will lower the prices of the stocks. So that's my presentation for today. Sorry, we've extended by about 10 minutes, but I thank you so much for your patience. If there are any questions, I can take them right now. There's Virginia who said, is it possible to share the presentation? Yes, I can share it with you on request. So what I'll do, let me just put some helpful links here. Let me just share my email address. You can reach me, I think for Gmail is easier, because let me post that on the chat. So you can reach me via kimarigilbert@gmail.com. So that's my email address. So just send me an email, and with your request, if you wish for me to share this presentation, I can email it to you. Is there any other question? Also, in case you have any questions, feel free to reach me on kimarigilbert@gmail.com. I also do have my work email here. Let me also post it. But I'm more active on my Gmail. I'd also want to share some links with you, some helpful links here. So there's the link to go to Scope Markets. Scope Markets is the one that has organized this webinar. So it would be good if you go and check out their website just to see all the other educational material that they also have. Also the account, you can open an account, a trading account with them. Good thing with Scope Markets is that you can even open a Kenya shilling Forex account. So if you just wanted to have it easier for you to use M-Pesa, fund your account, do your trading, withdraw via M-Pesa without currency conversions, then you can also open a Kenya shillings account with them. And I've also shared our YouTube page so that you can see our past webinars, including the guest webinars that we do. We also interview international traders from time to time. So thank you so much. If there are no questions, then I'd call it, let's wrap it up. Thank you for your time. Have a good weekend and a good holiday, and see you next Friday for our other webinar. So we'll be having a webinar at 2. So every Friday, 2 p.m. STL FX or Forex STL, and I think this one here was it was actually Forex STL. So just send to kimarigilbert@gmail.com. So every Friday at 2 p.m. we have a webinar. Either it's material like this, or we have interviews with international traders. So feel free to tune in, and see you next time. Thank you and have a good weekend. Thank you, Regina, and thank you, Travas.